I guess I've got a thing for bringing old machines back to life. Sometimes that's doing a full restoration on it. Sometimes it's just doing enough to get the machine working and chipping away at the smaller problems as I use it. I had a very generous viewer reach out to me recently and offer me some really interesting stuff. One thing was this Delta 17-inch drill press puzzle. He said he's pretty sure everything is here. Let's try to put it together and see. If you've been following my channel, you know my general sort of aesthetic with something like this is to take the rust off of the bare bits and leave the painted bits the way they are. Unless it's ugly green, then I'll repaint it. Since this is mostly gray and might actually be made from a couple different machines, I think I'm going to leave that alone and just try to clean up the rest of it. I feel like there's probably a euphemism here. Well, I think that's looking better. Kind of looks like maybe not everything is here, but I think the best bet is going to be to put together what I have and see what else I need. So after getting the spindle back in the quill, I realized these bearings felt really sloppy, and I think that's probably my problem, so I'll order up some new ones of those. There's a pretty ingenious little worm gear setup here to adjust the preload on the quill return spring. I do have the little pointer, which is pretty neat. So there's supposed to be a round bar that comes through here that this guard mounts to, but I'm missing that, so I guess it's time to start making some parts. That's why it ain't straight. At some point, someone unceremoniously added on these hinges. There are no corresponding holes in this piece for those hinges. The problem I run into is now there's this stud on here which doesn't have anywhere to go. Looking at my very greasy parts diagram, there's an extra little boss with a hole in it on the head that I don't have. So I did some digging through the various catalogs on vintagemachinery.org and spent some time talking to some people on the Delta Facebook group. And what I found out was this is an early head casting. They made these up until about 1941. This originally would have had a cast iron pulley cover on the front and then two die-cast pot metal covers on the back. The cast iron ones have tended to survive pretty well, but it sounds like the die-cast covers didn't last very long originally anyway. So around the end of 1941 they switched to using the stamped sheet metal covers. But unfortunately, these two don't work together. This one does have holes for a serial number tag, but that tag is missing. The serial number records only go back to 1941, but from what I've been told, there are serial numbers earlier than that. I think they originally introduced this drill press in 1937, so that kind of bookends this, being either late 30s or up to 1941. Managed to find some new old stock bearings on eBay for a reasonable price. But I got back in touch with the guy that gave this to me, and he managed to find the right guard for this head. Also explains why there's a threaded hole up here. The back guards are lost to time, and apparently they tended to break out anyway. Maybe someday I'll be able to track some down, or track down some that are broken and make some reproductions. Somebody on the Delta Tools Facebook group set me up with the shaft and worm gear for this, But since the worm gear doesn't fit through that hole anyway, I'm kind of wondering why that even needs to be threaded in there, why it can't just be a straight hole. The hub for the quill handles has these holes stripped out, drilled out. Looks like maybe it was pinned in at one point, but I'd like to put threads back in there. And this is one of those things where the setup takes longer than the machining. Made a little arbor to put it in the dividing head because this is kind of the easiest way to get a repeatable setup that's going to allow me to index it and get it at an angle. It looks like it should be about a 15-degree angle. I think most normal people would use a helicoil here, but it's a 7/16 fine thread, which I don't think would be something that I would use the rest of the kit on, and the kit's pretty expensive, so I'm going to do a little different. This one's also been blasted out to the point where it needs a little bit more help than a helicoil. I turned some little pieces of steel to be a slightly loose fit in the holes and then tried to braze them in, which would have worked great had I not run out of acetylene halfway through the process. But I got more acetylene and took another shot at it. It looks like the braze flowed down around pretty well there. Hitting it with the needle scaler does a pretty good job of mimicking the cast texture. So now that that's done, I can deal with these handles. The problem is I only have 2 of these. My local hardware store did have a ball knob. It's a little bit bigger than these and doesn't have the little bridge on it, but I think it'll work for now. So now I just need to make a shaft that's the right length. But these are different lengths, so which one do I base it off of? I kind of did that backwards from usual because I was going for the distance from the center of the ball to the end of these threads. Of course, I didn't get these threads fully cut, so I ran a die on there, and of course cross-threaded it and ruined the thing. So I made another one, and that should be good enough for the time being until I get tired of that knob being different and track down the right one for it. This is a 3-phase motor, 3/4 horsepower. Of course, they don't have 3-phase power in the shop, so I'll put a drive on it. Just made a little aluminum plate that'll clamp in between the motor and the mounting bracket. Well, the parts diagram calls these out as being 5/16 carriage bolts. But they definitely spin freely in there. 3/8 bolt doesn't fit through there. I'll probably regret this if I ever have to adjust the motor position. These set screws are supposed to be in the bottom. Looks like it's been brazed up at some point. There might be a few cracks in there too that'll have to get addressed at some point. Snap. I've got a drawer in the shop where I keep all of the belts that are the wrong size. Eventually one of them will be the right size for something. Pretty sure I had this one set aside for my rope tow. That seems about right. So I've got this to the point where if I hit run and start turning the frequency up, the motor should turn, and it tries to, for a little bit, and then it stops. So that ain't right. So, troubleshooting this, if we look at the resistance on the motor windings, between these two we've got 8.3. Between these two we've got 8.3. Between these two we've got 5.4. Which means that that winding is shorted somewhere. Pulled this thing apart in the hopes that maybe I could see something wrong with it. I'd already shrink wrapped the exposed part of these wires. I was hoping maybe I'd be able to find something I could fix, but that's not the case, and I don't think there's much I can do for this. Maybe one of you will tell me I'm wrong, and in this case I hope I am. Alright, got another motor. And of course the bolt pattern doesn't line up. I dropped one of the nuts into the motor. I don't really want to have to take this thing apart. Ah! That needs to go up a little bit, but that should work. This is a single-phase motor, so it's just going to get a switch. Yeah, something like that. Well, I can't say I love any of this, but at least I've got a motor that works now. Oh, me. What the fuck was that? Well, I tore into this thing, and the good news is I found the problem. It's this wire here that runs to this little thermal protection switch. The insulation's flaking off, and it was shorting back to the contacts for the starter switch. I've just got a lot of crumbly insulation here, so I'm going to see how much of that I can take care of. These little copper studs are soaking up too much heat. I mean, I'd be worried about damaging that insulation, but... Alright. Just cut that one. Come on. Went ahead and rewired what I could on here. What couldn't get rewired got shrink wrapped. I think I was saying something about having a working motor. Place your bets. Of course, since I changed to a smaller frame motor, that's a 5/8 shaft. That's a 3/4 inch bore. That's a problem that's pretty easily solved with one of these little sleeve kits. It just goes from 5/8 to 3/4. Has a little wider key in it, except it was originally a 3/16 square key, and we're adding a 1/16 to it, so it should be a quarter, but this is 5/16 for some reason. Did have to grab a shorter belt from my drawer of belts. This one's a little too short, but I think it'll be okay. And of course it's spinning the wrong way. 50-50 shot of getting it right. 100% chance that it's wrong. Now it's actually spinning the proper direction, so I could drill a hole with this. But first, in one of my weekly Patreon updates, I was talking about the handles that were wrong, and one of my patrons said he had a ball that was the right size, so he sent me one. The style's still a little bit off, but at least it's the right size, so we'll swap that out. Well, that's a bit of an improvement. Well, I can say this project certainly took more effort than I thought it would. And I guess all that's left to do now is throw a chuck in this and see if you can drill a hole for the first time in a few decades. We'll go for a 3/8 and a random piece of scrap metal here. I've already got 2 other drill presses and a milling machine, but what this one's going to let me do is drill in a much longer stock. I can either tilt the table or move it out of the way, so obviously if I was going to drill that, I'd clamp it on somehow. So having this is going to be a welcome addition to the shop. As is pretty much always the case with these older machines, that took a lot more effort than I thought it would. I mean, I didn't even get to show you the cool chain hoist he gave me. You're going to want to stick around for that one. And I've got to thank everyone who helps make these videos possible, either by giving me machines, parts for machines, support on Patreon or YouTube memberships, or just watching the video. That's kind of what makes this worthwhile. This thing could certainly use some more work, but the goal for now was to just get it usable.